The lecture today is, I guess it's the last one in the course. And the final theme of the course, as we have called it, is Modernity Beyond Enlightenment. This section of the course is mostly concerned with German idealism, and we're dealing here with a moment that is very interesting, a moment of break, of a rupture, first signaled by the French Revolution of 1798. And the German idealists, 17 years later, are the privileged observers of this break. Fichte himself stated that the intellectual movement of German idealism was a byproduct of the French Revolution. So the texts we're looking at this week come out of an incredible condensation in the history of thought. A moment in which we see the dawn of modernity, an end and a beginning, a watershed or a break. Kant had declared in the preface of the Metaphysical Foundations of the Doctrine of Right that philosophy had not existed prior to the Critique of Pure Reason of 1781. This is Kant, the first quote on the screen. It sounds arrogant, self-seeking, and for those who have not yet relinquished their old system, belittling to assert that prior to the development of critical philosophy, there had been no philosophy at all. As though that were not enough, Kant had concluded the Critique of Pure Reason, with which philosophy is supposed to have begun, by predicting that the completion of philosophy was now imminent, and to quote, "It may be possible to achieve before the end of the century what many centuries have not been able to accomplish in less than 19 years. This is only to be followed by Hegel, who announced the end of history, the end of the history of philosophy in a lecture held in spring of 1806. Quote from Hegel on the screen, "Herewith this history of philosophy comes to an end," end of quote. So this concern with ends and beginnings within these crucial 25 years of philosophy was evidence of the pathos of the historical moment. The revolutionary calendar had introduced the beginning of a new count, a break that is of world historical magnitude, and one which introduced for Hegel the coming of what he will call absolute knowledge. This absolute knowledge, for Hegel, as we will see today in the lecture, can only be attained by a full immersion in the historical moment. If Hegel's system, which he ends up constructing with the science of logic, was meant to be the end of philosophy, through its becoming a science, then philosophy after this could no longer be thought of as a love of wisdom or a love of knowledge. Rather, it must be cleansed from all inclination and predilections, and the engagement with knowledge now has nothing to do with proclamations of love for it. Philosophy must now become a science, and science is impersonal, actual knowledge, and not a love object. So this internal need for philosophy to become a science corresponds to the historical moment that creates this necessity. Philosophy is now co-implicated with history. It is no longer possible through a distant love relation. There is now a tragic dimension introduced. For philosophy to become actual, it must come to its end. In the preface of his Phenomenology, Hegel characterized his age as a period of transition, as a birth of a new age. So the movement of history is inseparable, he says, from that of spirit. And spirit for Hegel is a supra-individual reality, one that is never in a state of rest. The quote from Hegel, "It is here as in the case of a birth of a child. After a long period of nutrition and silence, the continuity of the gradual growth in size, of quantitative change, is suddenly cut short by the first breath of dawn. There is a break in the process, a qualitative change, and the child is born. In like manner, the spirit of the time, growing slowly and quietly, ripe for the new form it is to assume, disintegrates one fragment after another of the structure of its previous world. That it is tottering to its fall is only indicated by symptoms here and there. This gradual crumbling to pieces, which did not alter the general look and aspect of the whole, is interrupted by the sunrise, which in a flash and at a single stroke brings to view the form and structure of the new world," end of quote. So the oldest systematic program that you will look at of 1897, which is one of the texts you will be looking at in the next 2 weeks, is a curious and foundational text for the German idealists, and it expresses the spirit of the time. And I begin from there in order to show how Hegel departs from this early text and link that to Faust, to a certain kind of attempt to read Faust through Hegel. So this text is co-authored by Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, who were all roommates at Tübingen. Hegel was born in Stuttgart on the 27th of August, 1770. He was the first child of a minor financial official at the court of the Duke of Württemberg. As a schoolboy, he read wildly in the works of both classical and modern authors, including Homer, Sophocles, Euripides, Shakespeare, Klopstock, Goethe, and Schiller. In October 1788, he matriculated at the University of Tübingen to study theology, and during his 5 years there became friends with Friedrich Hölderlin, his exact contemporary, and Friedrich von Schelling, who was 4.5 years his junior. While in Tübingen, Hegel's notes and studies show that he had a very thorough knowledge of the chief figures of the French Enlightenment: Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, Holbach, Rousseau, and others. He had also read Hume's History of England, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, as well as Schiller's historical writings, essays by Benjamin Constant, and the works of the German revolutionary George Forster. Now, the three friends, Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, shared an enthusiasm for Plato, Lessing, Rousseau, and Jacobi's letters on the doctrine of Spinoza. And they especially shared an enthusiasm for the two great revolutions of the time: the political revolution started in France in 1789, and the intellectual revolution inaugurated in Germany in the early 1780s by the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. So their focus of attention at the time was particularly Kant's moral philosophy and the philosophy of religion. While Kant had understood moral problems from the standpoint of the individual, the so-called intelligible self, Hegel in his early years was interested in social praxis, in transformation of social reality by man himself. After all, Hegel was the philosopher who wrote, to quote him, "The reading of the daily newspaper is the morning prayer of the modern man." This is Hegel, i.e., it enables us to take a stand in the world and become conscious of the historical situation. As a theology student in Tübingen, Hegel came into contact with the religious mind of his age, with Schiller and Lessing. The question of freedom, however, was the background for his concern with religion. In his early theological writings, Hegel wrote against both the Christian religion and the state. Man's dignity, a word that him and Schiller used to translate the French rights of man, consists in, to quote Hegel, refusing to revere the statutes of the church or to obey the laws of the state, end of quote. So in his philosophy of history, Hegel saw that the collapse of city-states in antiquity and the rise of Christianity meant the disappearance of a society of human freedom and greatness, and the transformation of the heroic citoyen of the polis to the bourgeois egoistic individual. How to return from a religion of despotism and enslavement to a religion of freedom on the model of antiquity was a question that the early Hegel would be asking. But his understanding of religion, however, for Hegel, the understanding of religion is necessary for understanding what is. Religion, as he understood it or as he wrote about it, is above all a representation of collective life, a symbolic projection of concrete human problems. A quote from Hegel: "The state can only induce its citizens to make use of these institutions by inspiring confidence in them. Religion is the preeminent instrument for this purpose, and whether or not it can fulfill the task depends on the use made of it by the state. This purpose is clearly in evidence in the religions of all people." In Tübingen, Schelling and Hölderlin and Hegel were frustrated by the artificiality of politics and religion in their society, and hoped to see the neighboring revolution promote necessary radical change in their own country. In one of his notebooks, next to scribbles that he had all over the pages that read "Death to the Tyrants," Hegel described the ideal he shared with Hölderlin and Schelling to be that of reason and liberty. So the task of modern philosophy was constructing a philosophy of the idea for Hegel, who was an idealist from the beginning. Enlightenment cannot win over the enjoyments provided by folk religion, by the religion of the masses. It will constantly fail against this. Thus, in this early text, they argue for this mythology of reason that can only be constructed by constructing a philosophy of the idea, of what ought to be, by opposing what ought to be to what is. Philosophy is meant to awaken the minds that have been trapped in their present. In a letter to Schelling, dated April 16, 1795, Hegel wrote, By revealing how everything ought to be, it will sweep away, this philosophy, the indolence of those who confer eternity upon everything as it is. Sorry, as it is there, not as it. So what ought to be for the early Hegel is this kind of subjective public religion as a religion of self-liberation of the people versus a religion that is objective, that is codified in laws, because that for Hegel would be a dead religion. And again, this quote from him, "Memory is the gallows on which the Greek gods have been hanged. Memory is the grave, the repository of the dead. The dead dwell in it as dead matter. They are exhibited there like a collection of stones," end of quote. So this is somehow the driving thrust of the oldest systematic program, the project of creating a mythology of reason by which everything is judged by its idea, and where the critique of the state begins from specifying that it is not an idea. So this, you will read this in the coming weeks. Again, this is a selection from the oldest systematic program. "From nature, I come to the works of man. Guided by the idea of humanity, I intend to show that there can be no idea of the state, since the state is mechanical, just as there can be no such thing as the idea of a machine. Only that which is free can be called an idea. We must therefore transcend the state, for every state must treat free men as cogs in a machine, and this must be prevented. Hence the state must cease to exist," end of quote. From here on, the three, it's unclear who it is exactly who writes this, they go on to set out the principles for a history of mankind, and to expose, as they say, the entire wretched hodgepodge of the state, constitution, government, and legislature, end of quote. This is to be followed by ideas about morality and religion. Again, a quote, "The destruction of all false gods, the persecution of the priesthood with their new hypocritical adoption of reason, all this to be brought by reason itself. The absolute freedom of all spirits who bear the intellectual world within themselves and who may not seek either God or immortality outside of themselves." And we'll come to this specific quote by the end of the lecture in relationship to Faust. So despite it not being clear who of the three indeed authored this text, Hegel differed from Schelling and Hölderlin by his more historical approach, which he develops in his Phenomenology of Spirit and in his later work. So the destruction of the state for Hegel cannot but take account of the dialectical historical development of objective reality. The Ancien Régime, as he saw it before the French Revolution, was upheld by a distinction between what he called a noble consciousness and a base consciousness. The nobility that was once consecrated for the service of the state was now in the service of money. The nobility rejects the impurity of action for Hegel. Like the master in the master-slave dialectic, it lacks the force to externalize itself. It now takes offense and is humiliated by the culture surrounding it. This humiliation and disgust is pre-revolutionary mentality for Hegel. In it, the distinction between these two forms of consciousness becomes merely formal. Wealth is measured in terms of immediate satisfaction, which results in the depravity of the soul of the rich as well as their clients. So Hegel formulates these comments in the Phenomenology on what he calls this kind of pre-revolutionary, disintegrated consciousness by discussing a translation of Diderot's text, Rameau's Nephew, which was translated into German by no other than Goethe himself. This nephew in the novel is this social parasite, this ideal social parasite. He's a satire of his class. And he's in conversation with a philosopher throughout this novel. Hegel reads Rameau not as a unique individual, but as a vision of moral disintegration. Rameau, the Bohemian, lays bare for Hegel the comedy of the pre-revolutionary social order. This disintegrated consciousness, as Hegel puts it, is a result of an unhappy consciousness, as he called it. The honest philosopher, who is Rameau's interlocutor in this novel, is speechless in the face of the disintegrated soul of the Ancien Régime. Hegel, in his reading of Rameau, claims that the solution to the situation of disintegrated consciousness is a return of the whole onto itself. And this return can only involve the spirit of culture itself. And again, the quote, and can only mean that it must, qua spirit, return out of its confusion into itself and win for itself a still higher level of conscious life, end of quote. So consciousness, in Hegel's understanding, is the identity of thought with itself in its own disintegration. It is only self-consciousness that, through comprehending everything within itself, becomes in its universality an absolute liberty. Hegel said, "Spirit is time," in his Jena writings. For it is only in the temporality of consciousness that the whole, to quote, which develops itself, resolves its own development, and in this movement simply preserves itself, end of quote, and can be present to itself. Spirit is history, a history oriented to the future because it is an absolute principle of negativity, as Hegel put it. So spirit for Hegel is the consciousness of life. The consciousness of life, however, as we will see, is very different from life itself, and this is where Hegel will depart from the other romantics or the other romantics of his time. Self-consciousness for Hegel only emerges with the break from naive, immediate life, and this existence of self-consciousness emerges from the womb of the world as a negation of every particular modality of being. Further, to become conscious of life is to reflect upon death, to exist in the face of death itself. In 1801, Hegel left Frankfurt, and these will all be, I will go through these through the reading of Faust, all these points that I just made. So in 1801, Hegel left Frankfurt to join Schelling in Jena, which not long before had been home to both Fichte and the circle of the Romantics around Friedrich Schlegel. In 1807, he published his work, which marks the beginning of his philosophical maturity, The Phenomenology of Spirit. In this work, from which you will be reading an extract, The Lord and the Bondsman, Hegel radically departs from his early work and from everything Schelling or Fichte had attempted before. In The Phenomenology, he provides an account of the development of consciousness from the standpoint of immediate sense certainty to the standpoint of what he will call absolute knowing or philosophy itself. So while he was in Tübingen, he was an avid enthusiast for the French Revolution. However, he was skeptical about the naive enthusiasm for change, for the sake of change, and of the disparaging opposition to change. He saw the need or the answer to these both positions was a rediscovery of the path through which the human spirit had reached its historical present in terms of its past development. Spirit is what it is only through what it has already come to be, through its own history for Hegel. So in order to retread this path, Hegel would attempt the massive feat of relating the singular and the universal, or as he put it, to think life, as he put it. The concept of life was an important one for the German Romantics. Herder, Goethe, Schelling all used the Spinozan language to reconcile nature understood as an infinite productivity with matter, with a conditional and limited product. Concepts like world soul were proposed for this kind of reconciliation in which matter, force, and spirit are all united. And in Faust, we can see already life being posited against some kind of moribund speculation. This is Faust. Instead of living nature in which God created man, you're surrounded by smoke and rot, animal skeletons and dead man's bones. So Hegel, for Hegel, there is no infinite as such understood as productivity without concrete oppositions. The infinite is not what lies beyond finite oppositions, but it is the finite oppositions themselves that are infinite. Unlike the Romantics, Hegel posited a distinction between life and the consciousness of life. Living thought, or the thought of human life, can only occur by a certain departure from nature. It is not an intuition of nature, but a development of consciousness. Thus, he does not share the cosmic sympathies of Schelling, for instance. For Hegel, nature is an inferior moment of the idea. It is not a complete manifestation of the absolute, as he says. For him, the spirit of nature, to quote the quote on the screen, does not develop itself in the same form as spirit. It is only spirit for the spirit who is conscious of it. It is spirit in itself, but not for itself. Thus, for Hegel, spirit is that which discovers itself, and nature is only a scene for that discovery. Nature's spirit is hidden. While the Romantics considered the notion of life as a totality, as you see with the questions posed by Faust, eternal nature, where shall I grasp you? Where are you? Breasts, you springs of life, on which hang heaven and earth, toward which the parched heart presses. You flow, you suckle, must I do without you? This is Faust. So while the Romantics debated nature in terms of its infinite productivity versus its conditioned and limited product, following Kant, who had declared a supra-sensible substratum of nature as unknowable, Hegel did not agree with the Romantic propositions of some unknowable world soul. a unity or identity from which everything flows and to which everything flows. Rather, Hegel saw contradiction and opposition as absolutes. He proposed a dialectical mode of thought premised on opposition as absolute. There is no infinite beyond knowledge, and the absolute is not a unity or an identity, but ultimately for Hegel it is a negative power, an activity that posits division and contradiction in itself in order to negate it. So Hegel's path towards his later conception of spirit as a unity in difference is clearly opened up by his famous and much quoted claim that, to quote, life is the union of union and non-union, end of quote. So life does not exclude opposition on this view. Rather, it includes death, opposition, and understanding within itself. So this is Hegel and Goethe on the other. The activity of dissolution is the power and work of the understanding, the most astonishing and mightiest of powers, or rather the absolute power. The circle that remains self-enclosed and like substance holds its moments together is an immediate relationship, one therefore which has nothing astonishing about it, but that an accident as such, detached from what circumscribes it, what is bound and is actual only in its context with others, should attain an existence of its own and a separate freedom. This is the tremendous power of the negative. It is the energy of thought, of the pure I. Goethe, on the other side, when I see an object before me which has come into existence, wonder about its genesis, measure out the course of its becoming as far as I can follow it, I become aware of a series of stages, the individual parts, which I cannot perceive next to each other, but which I must make present to myself in memory as a certain ideal whole. At first, I'm inclined to imagine distinct steps, but since nature makes no leaps, I'm finally compelled to intuit a sequence of uninterrupted activity as a whole by negating the individual parts, but without destroying the impression. So, is this the one you fixed? No, it's fine. So in Goethe's Faust, and this is where I want to enter to Goethe's Faust through his concept of negation or negativity. In Goethe's Faust, we see how the principle of negativity embodied in Mephistopheles is necessary for consciousness to unfold. One that is not Faust's own individual self, but one that stands in for the movement of thought itself. In a sense, we see staged between Faust and Mephistopheles negation as the logical operator that creates the modern subject or a subject, and I will come to this again, and this is what I will try to elucidate in the rest of this. So again, when Faust first meets Mephistopheles in his study, and he asks him, "Who are you?" Mephistopheles responds, "I am the spirit of perpetual negation, and rightly so, for all things that exist deserve to perish and would not be missed. Much better it would be if nothing were brought into being. Thus, what you men call destruction, sin, evil, in short, is all my sphere, the element I most prefer. Faust, you seem complete and whole, yet you say you are part. Mephistopheles, I speak the modest truth. I use no art. Let foolish little human souls delude themselves that they are wholes. I am part of that part which once when all began, was all there was, part of darkness before man. Whence light was born, proud light, which now makes futile war, to wrest from night its mother what before was hers, her ancient place in space. For light depends on the corporeal worlds, matter that sends visible light out, stops light in its stride, and by reflected light is beautified. So light will not last long, I fear. Matter shall be destroyed, and light shall disappear." Faust, in his introduction to Mephistopheles, is introduced to this element of negation. Again, Mephistopheles, in this very same dialogue towards the end, he says, "The something, this coarse world, this mess, stands in the way of nothingness." Faust responds, "And so ever-stirring, wholesome energy of life is your arch enemy." So, in the letter exchanges between Hegel and Goethe, which were around 10 letters that were exchanged, it's not surprising that Hegel would tell Goethe in a letter in 1825, and I quote Hegel here, "When I survey my intellectual development, I find you everywhere interwoven therein." This is to Goethe. So, concomitant to Hegel's project and what it reveals about philosophy at the dawn of modernity, Goethe's Faust poses a parallel question. It enacts the situation of art in modernity. The experience of art in its fullness is no longer accessible to us. Art now makes a claim on us in terms of a historical consciousness. As Hegel himself put it in his lectures on art, where he also declared the end of art, he says, "No matter how beautiful we find a statue, our knee no longer bends before it," Hegel. So the path to the reconstitution of philosophy for Hegel as art in Goethe's Faust must come with the recognition that human life is historical through and through. In his lectures on tragedy, Hegel saw Faust as an absolutely philosophical tragedy, showing the tragic quest for harmony between the absolute and the individual's knowledge and will. This is the quote from Hegel. I think it's on, I will go on. So Hegel characterized the difference between Greek tragedies and modern tragedies as a difference introduced by this principle of subjectivity. This is from Hegel's lectures on tragedy. But in modern tragedy, it is generally the case that individuals do not act for the sake of the substantial nature of their end, nor is it that nature which proves to be their motive and their passion. On the contrary, what presses for satisfaction is the subjectivity of their heart and mind and the privacy of their own character. And he says of Faust, Goethe's Faust, the absolute philosophical tragedy, is here on the one side dissatisfaction with learning, and on the other, the freshness of life and enjoyment in the world. In general, the tragic quest for harmony between the absolute in its essence and appearance and the individual's knowledge and will. All this provides a breadth of subject matter which no other dramatist has ventured to compass in one and the same work. End of quote. So, I think what the point I'm trying to make is that Faust is a Hegelian subject because he treads through this path of negativity, makes a pact with the devil. He is an example of subjectivity, achieving an awareness of autonomy by recognizing the supramundane God. The supramundane God and the structure of consciousness to which he owes his existence. In a sense, Goethe dramatizes Hegel's path towards self-consciousness. Faust stages the link between maturation and enlightenment, which is, again, not a question of individual life, but the development of humanity itself towards maturation and progressive emancipation, enlightenment. So the tragedy, in a sense, asks, how are these two structures interwoven? How can they be interwoven? Faust, in his reflexive stance towards experience, ends up providing us, throughout this tragedy, with a cultural archive, a form of a historical consciousness. It can only be compared, in a sense, to an encyclopedia, which is a very important genre of the time. He is almost, Faust, an encyclopedic figure of sorts by which the experience of all of humanity is being staged. So he treads the path of enlightenment, which in its core was the project of unfolding the inner structure of knowledge, to map knowledge in all its manifestations, the project of the knowledge of knowledge, where Hegel, the project of absolute knowledge. And like the projects of Hegel and Novalis and Diderot and d'Alembert, Goethe's Faust can be read as an encyclopedia of European cultural memory. And the Helen of Troy in Faust II, the military exploits, the colonial rule, the social and utopian community of free individuals, all of this, born from Mephistopheles, born from nothingness, and directed to this open future. So the modern subject, Faust, tells us, as does Hegel, is only motivated by two things: knowledge and desire, with a disregard to all traditional codes. Faust's pact with the devil, his necromancy or his wager on the devil, is in a sense this kind of wager on negativity. Now, the power of the negative is the absolute power for Hegel. For isn't Goethe's Faust, his development and fulfillment, implicitly his very death? The growth of the individual as a living being is by means of his own negation and maturation, is what Faust seems to tell us. Hegel maintained that the living being, in positing himself, negates himself. It is, to quote, just as much a formation of independent individual shapes as it is a way of cancelling a shape assumed, end of quote. So the life of the child is the death of the parent. In this cycle of life, the universal and the individual interpenetrate. As a totality, life can only be conceptualized, for Hegel, by transcending differentiations, but it also needs to presuppose separate structures. The engine of this process is the power of negativity. So the individual life form has to negate itself Faust's wager with Mephistopheles, and then it has to negate its negation, Faust's negation of Mephistopheles by the end of Faust 2, in order to return to a totality. This is the development of consciousness for Hegel and this dialectic of the absolute spirit. It can be read in this way. Now, as I've already said, the task of philosophy for Hegel is not to be a philosophy of nature, but to be a philosophy of the life of consciousness. So it denounces all that is dead in the living body of spirit. Consciousness, thus, is not a consciousness of nature, but a relation between two self-consciousnesses, between man and man, individual and society, master and slave. And in the Phenomenology, and you will read this selection next week in the Lord and the Bondsman section, we see this dialectic of recognition as it unfolds between two self-consciousnesses, the master and the slave. And through this dialectic of recognition, there's an immediate change of relations of domination and servitude. The master becomes an instrument of his own enslavement, while the slave becomes a master of the master through his labor. What the slave fears the most is the death of the master. So I won't go much into this section here today, but in the Lord and Bondsman selection, Hegel introduces for us a dialectic of recognition that is premised on desire. The struggle to death is the condition of history. Each seeks the death of the other and demands to be recognized by the other as a pure being for itself, realized as absolute negativity, beyond being merely a simple biological organism or a living object. So human self-consciousness in this dialectic of recognition between two consciousnesses is premised in the first place on desire, on a desire that is never satisfied. And Faust is precisely also placed into this kind of problematic. Man desires to live, but life in him appears at once as something identical and alien to him. Think of Hamlet, the time is out of joint, better not to be, another figure of negativity. Think of Mephistopheles. So consciousness of life is premised on a diremption, a disjunction, a break, that is put into play by the negative principle of desire. So we go back to the prologue in heaven. What does the Lord say to Mephistopheles in the prologue? He says, "You are a type I never learned to hate, among the spirits who negate. The ironic scold offends me least of all. Man is too apt to sink into pure satisfaction. A total standstill is his constant wish. Therefore your company, busily devilish, serves well to stimulate him into action." So Hegel introduces desire or deduces it from the concept of life, not as a biological life, but as what includes both subjects and objects, the animate and the inanimate. It is what is maintained with the passing of all entities which are caught in its circle. If life can only survive death as a universal, then desire surely is not a life function. The struggle is not for survival between the slave and the master, but it is about the willingness to put more at stake than one's mere survival. The slave wants life over liberty and hence must labor endlessly, become a mere consciousness of thinghood, as Hegel says, while the master is a master over one who has squandered away the status of subject, a master of someone who is not worthy to provide recognition. From this struggle emerges death as the absolute principle of negativity through which human history is generated. It is, as Hegel would put it, a freedom towards death. The true life of spirit is not one who recoils from death or becomes conscious of it, but in one who internalizes death. A quote from Hegel, "It is the magic power that converts the negative into being," end of quote. So this is the Hegelian understanding of the subject, that which contains human history, not limited to any particular being. Thus, who is Faust in Goethe's tragedy, if not the coming into being of a subject? Faust, if I ever lie down in sloth and base inaction, then let that moment be my end. I'll be your false cajolery, you lull me into self-sufficiency. If any pleasure you can give deludes me, let me cease to live, I offer you this wager. So the exchange of knowledge for pleasure, for desire, is the wager. Faust says, I tell you, the mere pleasure is not the point. To dizzying, painful joy I dedicate myself to refreshing frustration, loving hate. I've purged the lust for knowledge from my soul. Now the full range of suffering it shall face. Now my inner self I will embrace, the experience allotted to the whole race of mankind. My mind shall grasp the heights and depths. My heart knows all their sorrows and delights. Thus I will expand myself, and their self I shall be, and perish in the end like all humanity. So again, the structure of this wager can be read through Hegel. God dies in man, while man raises himself to the divine through a history that is his judge. And here one can go back to the beginning quote from the beginning. So the destruction of all false gods, the persecution of the priesthood, with their new hypocritical adoption of reason, all this to be brought by reason itself, the absolute freedom of all spirits who bear the intellectual world within themselves and who may not seek either God or immortality outside of themselves. So again, the structure of the wager can be read as this: God dies in man, while man raises himself to the divine through a history that becomes his judge. So in a sense, like Faust's story rehearses all the stages of classical mythology, in order for him to be the mythic figure of modernity or the subject of history, Hegel, if we go back to the oldest systematic program, makes a similar claim. Enlightened philosophy, or the Enlightenment of Kant, the exit from conditions of immaturity or the conditions of minority, doesn't have the heart and fantasy that the previous religion possessed. So reason as such has to return to its, or has to formulate its own mythology of reason. Hegel, or the three of them in the oldest systematic program, until we make ideas aesthetic, i.e. mythological, they hold no interest for the people. And conversely, before mythology is reasonable, the philosopher must be ashamed of it. Thus, finally, the enlightened and unenlightened must shake hands. Mythology must become philosophical, and the people reasonable, and philosophy must become mythological in order to make philosophy sensual. Then external unity will reign among us. Never again the contemptuous glance, never the blind trembling of the people before its wise men and priests. Only then does equal development of all powers await us, of the individual as well as of all individuals of. No power will be suppressed any longer. Then general freedom and equality of spirits will reign. A higher spirit sent from heaven must establish this religion among us. It will be the last work of the human race. And what could this higher spirit be rather than, let's say, Mephistopheles as this kind of the spirit of the negative? So it's a short lecture. It's over. Yeah, okay.